Iceland's economy is contracting at the fastest rate of any OECD economy. And this civil action movement, is the best news that I have heard about Iceland for several months. The movement signals that the population of Iceland is not just passively waiting for ministers and the central bank and the IMF to solve the problem. The population is trying to get involved in a constructive way. I think that is excellent news. In the Financial Times of the 2nd of July 2008, I wrote an article about Iceland called "Iceland Pays the Price for Financial Excess." Financial excess. It happened that on the morning of 2nd of July, I was at a conference together with John Lipsky, the number 2 man at the IMF. And when John Lipsky read my article in the Financial Times, he came running up to me and other participants at the conference and waved the Financial Times and said to me, "Thank you so much for writing this article. It is very valuable." So he, at least, was very enthusiastic about the appearance of this article. In Iceland, on the other hand, a great many economists and others were extremely disapproving of the article. I had some truly astonishingly negative emails from Icelandic economists about it. However, my favorite reaction was from your Prime Minister, who, when asked about it in an interview, dismissed the article as worth no more attention than a letter in DV. I had by that time come to Iceland several times, and 10 years ago I had spent a lot of time studying the East Asian crisis. By the summer of 2007, I was really worried about Iceland. I thought Iceland was dynamite waiting to explode because of the similarities with what happened in East Asia in the mid-1990s. So it is against that background that I'm not entirely surprised at what has happened here. But let me begin by talking about the global crisis, and then I'll come back to Iceland. Many analysts now agree that the world economy has entered not just a recession, but a depression. Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2008, said just 1 week ago from today, quote, "This looks an awful lot like the beginning of a second Great Depression." He went on to say that, quote, "Recent economic numbers have been terrifying, not just in the United States, but around the world. Manufacturing in particular is plunging everywhere. Banks are not lending, businesses and consumers are not spending." A depression is different from a recession, not just because it lasts for longer, and not just because the fall in output is greater, but also because there's a general fall in the price level, and a depression, in particular because of this combination of falls in output and falling prices, is very, very difficult to get out of. It looks like the world economy is entering such a depression. The crisis is clearly a crisis of the system, not just a crisis in the system. The East Asian crisis was a crisis in the world economy. This is a crisis of the world economy, and the first one since the 1930s. It is global in scope, so there are no fast-growing regions which can provide support for the resumption of growth in the crisis-affected regions. And also, secondly, it is the case that that policy instruments such as fiscal policy, monetary policy, and also the built-in stabilizers such as bankruptcy protection no longer work. They are no longer effective. The US government, for example, has been following the Colin Powell military doctrine of shock and awe with reference to the economy, that is, throwing every possible instrument at the problem, including the kitchen sink. But none of these things are working, and the news from the United States keeps getting worse. Looking forward, I suggest that the world economy will probably hit another tipping point similar to the one in September 2008 at the time of the Lehman Brothers collapse. It will probably hit a second tipping point around about March, April, May of this year, 2009. The tipping point will be caused by the rise of general awareness throughout Europe, America, Asia, Latin America, that hundreds of millions of people in rich countries and in poor countries are experiencing sharp falls in consumption standards, that the crisis is getting worse, not better, and that it has escaped the control of public authorities. So now, in these months, from January, February, March, April, May, is do or die time. This is the time when governments must take action to equip themselves to cope with a number of problems that are quite predictable, and I'm going to make now 4 predictions about what is happening. First of all, governments have to equip themselves to cope with a surge of unemployment. Secondly, a collapse of pension funds, of capital-funded pension funds because of the collapse of stock markets. Thirdly, governments have to cope with fierce anger being directed at them by their citizens, which may take the form of large-scale civil unrest. And fourth, I doubt whether there will be any significant recovery of economic growth in the world economy at large or in Iceland until late 2010 at the very earliest. Those are 4 predictions about what's coming. Governments know what's coming. They must act now to prepare themselves for these. On the other hand, there is good news about the world economy. And the first piece of good news, in my view, is that this current global crisis has discredited or delegitimized the neoliberal or free market ideology that's dominated economic thinking for the past 30 years, here and elsewhere. Governments are having to intervene in the economy much more than in the past, not just in finance, because of this. The current crisis represents a spectacular market failure, and everyone, even neoclassical economists, have long accepted that market failure provides justification for government intervention.